All right. Good morning. Good morning again.
Good morning.
All right. Very good. Glad you guys are awake this morning. Well, have you guys been listening to some of what's been being said this morning? What's one of the words that's come up a lot? Is any word that's jumped out at you that you've heard a lot this morning so far? I've been hearing, yeah? Love. Yeah. I've been hearing a lot of talk about love. And I love to talk about love because you know what we're going to talk about this morning? Well, it kind of gets back to love. I have a story for us, but before that story, I actually was going to read these verses, and I feel like they fit in quite smoothly with what we've already been discussing. So I want you to listen close to these verses, and then I'll tell you the name of the story just to get your juices to start flowing. The name of the story, actually, I got to remember it is called The Story of the King of Balls. The Story of the King of Balls. And we're going to hit on some themes today. We're going to look at a couple questions, a couple core questions, and they kind of revolve around this subject. And one of the questions we're looking at is, what is God like? We're looking at the question, what is God? Have any of you guys ever wondered what God is like? What is God like? How do we know what God is like? If I was addressing this subject, if I was addressing this story to adults or this theme, I would say, which God do you worship? But a lot of you guys are young and you're still forming some ideas of what God actually looks like, what God is, who God is. So I'm going to ask you the question this morning, what is God like? What is God like? And we're going to find some of that out in the story. To think about, some verses to think about that go with this. In 1 John chapter 4, it says, verse 12, no one has seen God at any time. If we love one another, God abides in us, and his love is perfected in us. And then on down a little bit further in verse 16, it says, we have come to know and have believed the love which God has for us. God is love. How about that? God is love. And the one who abides in love abides in God, and God abides in him. Now that I find very interesting. You know why that's so interesting to me? If God is love, well, let's get to the story, because I think the story will help us understand that even better. So, once upon a time, we're going to go way back. Close your eyes. Once upon a time. Way back, a long time ago. A long time ago. Can you see a village? Do you see the village? Close your eyes if you can't see a village and just imagine a village. Once upon a time there was a village. And in that village, there was a very, very special village. They were not like a lot of the other villages. This village, the kids loved to play. And the reason they loved to play is because they loved balls. Balls were one of their favorite toys, and they played with balls all the time. In fact, they played soccer ball. They played basketball. They played baseball. They played tennis ball. Any ball you can think of or imagine, they played with. And football, yes, they played football, absolutely. They played with all the different balls you can imagine, and they would throw their balls back and forth. Every morning and kickball. Well, actually, kickball is the one game they hadn't learned about yet, but they're going to learn about it. You're going to find out about it. Which one? Paintballs? Yeah, I suppose they might even have some. So in this village, if you would wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning and you would get up and you would hear the rooster crow, you would look out and guess what you would see? You would see kids everywhere throwing balls. You would see a ball flying up and another kid would catch it. They'd be running out, jump, catch the ball. They had balls of all kinds and they would be throwing them back and forth. You want to catch that? And they would be throwing them to one another, and then you got to throw it back. Throw it up here. There you go. Oh, yeah. And that was, thank you. Oh, yes. That's the kind of life that this village experienced. The balls were flying up and the balls were flying back. The kids loved balls. And you know what? That even went on into some of their adult lives. Some of the older people liked balls too, and they would be playing with balls. They were throwing them around. And one thing about the balls in that village, those balls almost never sat still. And there were thousands of balls. Thousands of balls. They were being used all the time because they were throwing them back and forth, and they always had a new game to be invented. New games were being invented all the time. In fact, that's where a lot of games came from that kids had never heard of, because there were so many games that you could play with balls, and they were playing them all, and they would invent new ones and learn how to play new ones. Well, because this village was known so well as the Ball Village, and because they became so famous for their play, and any kid that ever came there from another town or from another village would just get caught into the games, and they would go home and never be the same because they'd have so much fun there. Because of that, they had a brilliant idea one day. Actually, it was a young man. He was in his 20s, his early 20s. He was a pretty strong man, and all the village admired him very much, and they liked him and looked up to him. And he had a brilliant idea one day. He was sitting in his study, studying about balls. And in his study, he learned and he thought to himself, why don't we make ourselves a big golden statue? And we could put that statue at the front of our village, and when people come in from other towns, they will see on this statue, and we could make the statue look kind of like this. He would hold one ball out like this. It would be a statue of a man, a strong young man, and he would hold one ball up in his hand and the other ball close to his chest. And he would be able to be seen from far and wide. Everybody that would come around could see him. And he said, why don't we put him in the front? That way we don't have to always tell everybody what we're about. People will come in and they'll know this is what marks our village. We're the Ball Village. And the other people in the village thought, that's a great idea. And so you know what they did? And this man had the brilliant idea that everyone in the whole village would take all of their gold and their silver. They took their earrings and they melted it down, and their silverware out of their kitchen, all of them that had gold or any kind of precious metal, and they melted it into one big pot, and he became the carver. And he carved out this amazing giant statue of a glorious young man, strong and muscular, and he was in the front of the village. Now, what an idea was that? All the people that came now, they could see that this was the Ball Village because there stood the statue with his ball up in the air and the other ball holding it close to his chest. And you know what started to happen? They put that village up, and everybody thought how amazing it was and how beautiful statue it was. It was tall. It was taller than the ceiling right here that you can see. It was so high that you could see it from the neighboring village. And that it was actually almost as high as this house. That's how high the statue was. Well, that statue stood up there, and people would come from far and wide, and they would see it. But you know who else would see it every day? The people that lived there. The villagers would see it. And the kids would see it. And everybody in the village would see it, and the moms and the dads would see it. And you know what started to happen? Everybody in that village began to admire the amazing statue. And they slowly began to forget how much fun they had playing games. And in the mornings at 5 o'clock, instead of everyone going out and playing with their balls and throwing them back and forth, they would all go out to stare up at the beautiful statue and admire what they had become. And they would look at the statue holding the one ball up in his hand and the other ball close to his chest, and they began to think that maybe that's who they were and maybe that's what they need to do. So instead of throwing the balls back and forth and inventing new games, they all began to cling to their balls. And they couldn't get enough of them. They would hold the balls, and the little kids would find a ball, and if they would find one or two, that was never enough, and they would start saying, mine, 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 that's mine. And they would grab from each other. And instead of playing fun games together, they would grab the other kids' balls and hold them close to their chest or hold them up high so their little brother couldn't reach it. And they would hold it and hold it away and try to cling to as many balls as they could. Sometimes kids would get a big pile of balls and they'd be falling out of their hands and they'd be running away from other kids. And sometimes kids were so grumpy and so angry and screaming because they didn't have enough of balls that the only way their moms and dads could get them to calm down is they would give them another ball. Their moms and dads would go crazy if they didn't have a ball. And so they would look all around the house for a ball, and they would make sure they'd find enough for each kid. And if their kid was screaming, they would just give them a ball. and that would make them be happy. But they weren't really happy because they never felt like they had enough. And because there were thousands of them, they never knew where they could get. They always wanted to have all the balls in their possession, and they kept seeing the statue and thinking, well, we got to have that ball and hug it tight and keep it close and not let anyone else have it. And the village that was once known for being happy and joyful and throwing balls back and forth from person to person and from kid to kid and inventing new ideas and new games, all of a sudden became stagnant and stuck. And it was sad because they became one of the saddest villages and one of the grumpiest villages. And their golden statue was standing high, and everyone could see that this was supposed to be the ball village, and even the statue had a big smile on his face, and they knew they were supposed to be smiling. So some of the kids would even walk around with big smiles on their face, but as soon as you would grab one of their balls, they would say, mine, 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 and then they'd put their fake smile back on. It was really sad. Well, as time went on, their village became cruder and kind of meaner and frustrated and more upset with each other, and the kids got more and more angry with each other, and the parents got more and more angry and upset with the kids, until one day, as things happen in the village, as things always happen, there was a big thunderstorm that came along. A big thunderstorm, the biggest thunderstorm that ever was. And you know what? That rain came down so heavy and so strong. The rain poured down, the floods came down, the water started to rise. And you know what collapsed? The statue. The statue fell over from the floods, and it shattered into 1,000 pieces, and it washed away with the river. And the rain had gone on for about 3 days and 3 nights, and it continued to go on, and the rain kept coming, and the storms were strong. Actually, some of them did have to make a boat because the waters were getting so high. And you know what else started to wash away? The balls. The thousands of balls that were in that village began to sweep out with the flood. And the balls washed away down the stream. The balls washed away with the pieces of statue. One arm floated down the river, and some of the kids were up in their bedrooms, and they were looking out the window, and they'd see the water was getting up so high, and the currents were carrying the pieces of their statue away. And some of them started to cry. Some of them cried for the first time in their lives. They said, there goes our statue. That's what we're known for. There goes the ball. And then they would see their favorite balls, the ones that they liked to grab and hold to their heart. They would see their balls floating down the river. Well, as time went on, after a number of days, the rain settled down and the waters began to go down. And after so many days, the place got quiet, still. And for the first time in some of the youngest kids' lives, some of them that had just been born since the statue was built and never knew what it was like before then, for the first time they heard quiet and silence. And that morning everybody walked out and it was still as quiet as can be. You could hear a pin drop. It was so quiet, and the birds were singing for the first time again. The sun started to come out, and all the people were looking around at all the debris that was everywhere and the bramble that had gone everywhere and the statue. They went to where the statue was, and the statue was gone. And you know there was not one single tennis ball left in that village. There was not one single basketball. There was only one of any kind of ball left. There was one ball. One ball left. And it was in the basement of one of the houses that was highest up on the hill. And that ball didn't get washed away. So that ball was this purple ball. That was the only ball that was left. And some of the kids went into that basement and they found that ball. And at first all the kids, when they heard that there was a ball, all the kids flocked to that house and they started screaming and grabbing again. And soon the silence had turned into noise, and everybody was grasping for that one ball, and they started to grab for it. And after a bit, they realized, there's only one ball left. This isn't going to be enough for us all to have our ball to hold close to our heart. And the vision that they had, the mental image of the statue, that all of a sudden began to fade in their minds, and they couldn't even remember exactly what was there. And one little boy, his name was Johnny, he had a brilliant idea. He said, why don't we play a game with that ball and we could all have fun together? So you know what they did? They, for the first time in years, invented a new game, and they called it kickball. And they started to kick that ball back and forth, and they all started to play again, and they threw the ball out, or they threw the ball to the pitcher, and the pitcher threw it to somebody else, and they kicked it around, and and they all cheered. And so clap your hands and cheer. Woo! And suddenly, it took a while, guys. It took a while. But slowly over time, something deep down inside them that knew that something was missing, it rekindled in them. And they knew that balls were not meant to be held and meant to be held close to their chest, meant to be held up in a glorious way. They were meant to be played with. Yes. You need a ball? I'm going to keep the ball for the rest of our time, but I want you to imagine a ball, the lonely life of a ball that never gets played with. Do you know another way of saying this? And there's another story that's kind of similar to this, and that's about a guitar that never got played. Can you imagine a guitar hanging in a guitar shop that nobody ever gets to play with? Maybe even the most beautiful guitar with the best of sound. If there's no one to play it, if there's nothing happening to the guitar, is it of any value? No. It might as well be smashed, right? The joy of a guitar is its sound, right? The sound that it makes. Well, that story tells us a lot about what God is like. Did you know that to say God is love is to say a lot more than a mouthful, more than you could ever imagine? Because when you're saying that God is love, do you know what love requires? Love requires that you have a back and a forth, right? Love requires that I throw, the ball has a relationship, that there's two people relating in relationship, right? And if God is love, that means God is not a lonely old man up in the sky somewhere. God is not one individual. God is, and some have put it, God is Father and Son and Holy Spirit. Do you know Jesus talked about that? You guys can sit down. I'm gonna pray, and then you guys can go back to your parents, okay? I want you to think about this story and what that means, about what that tells us about what God is like. And when you go home, ask your mom and dad which God they worship, okay? Dear Jesus, thank you so much for these children and for all the life and the energy and the flow of energy that's in this room. And we invite that flow to continue and to grow and to blossom and to be spread far and wide. And thank you for the story of the Ball King and the energy that brings us, and the reminder that we are not meant to be individuals, but we're meant to be in relationship, and that reflects exactly who you are and what you're like. Amen. I did have one other thing I forgot to tell you, and that is that the statue in this story, he had a crown on his head, and everybody called him the Ball King. And did you know that Jesus once that people tried to make him a king? They tried to take a crown and put it on Jesus. It was after he turned the loaves and the fishes and multiplied them so that people could eat them. All the people were chasing him with the crown, and they said, "We want you to be our king." Do you know that Jesus refused that? He said, "No, I'm not that kind of king." Because he said, "I am in my Father, and my Father is in me. I'm in my daddy, and my daddy is in me." Jesus was in a relationship. And that's what God is like. God is a relationship. God is the great relationship. We worship the great community. I hope you worship the great community. And I hope we can learn more about that this week. Thank you guys for your attention.